Klondike, my country, my papa country. Before he come fight me.
This old Indian remembered when there were no white men in the Yukon.
You know Jack McQuestion? Jack in a costume before this country here was the Harper too.
She admired Jack McQuestion and Arthur Harper. They were the early traders who opened up the Yukon Valley to the gold seekers.
Siwas George, you know me?
Something about Siwas George Carmack amused her. Maybe it was because he married an Indian and tried to live like one.
He comes there when I take night time, daytime, and find it gold.
But she had a certain respect for him, for he had picked up the nuggets that started the big stampede to the Klondike. But the gold rush into the north didn't start with the Klondike, and it didn't end there either. It started in '49 at Sutter's Mill. It started in the old gold towns of the West, Pikes Peak, Virginia City, and Cripple Creek. In British Columbia, Indians sold nuggets of gold to Hudson Bay traders. Down on the Barbary Coast, some restless 49ers got wind of it and took off for the north. Then a fellow by the name of Hill made a strike in the Fraser River, and the stampede started. Back east, there was a depression, and men were clubbing each other in the street for a handful of food when they got the word and headed west. They heard about it in Liverpool, Brisbane, and Rio de Janeiro, and men dropped whatever they were doing and set out for a river somewhere north of 49. They poured into the canyons of the Caribou and up the valleys of the Cassiar, and they cut across to the Silver Bow Basin. Through desolate mountains, down violent rivers, and over the glaciers, they crawled, fought, and died, and some of their bones bleached out where they fell. Each man had the same disease that drove him on, and tortured, starved, and wasted him, but never let him go. He pushed further and further north and out across the Yukon Valley, and all the while he was setting the stage for the greatest gold rush the world had ever known. 3 traders opened up the Yukon Valley for the gold seekers. One was Big Jack McQuestion.
His name is Leroy Napoleon McQuestion, but the story goes in a rough sea one time, something broke on the mast, he went and climbed it, and they called him Jack the Sailor.
Many a sourdough had Jack McQuestion to thank for his grub stake and his life. He kept men from starvation. He gave them new outfits before they paid for the old ones, and he never pressed them for payment. This generosity was a trademark to the end of his life.
When I was going to school, I'd say, Dad, can I have a new dress for the party? Yes. Can I have new shoes for the party? Yes. Well, can I have a party too? Yes. He was so good to us, and he was so fair and honest.
You could say the same thing about Arthur Harper. The first issue of the Klondike News paid him a tribute.
Mr. Harper's residence at Fort Selkirk had probably more to do with placating the hostile Indians and thus allowing the white man to develop the country than any other factor in the history of the interior.
Captain Al Mayo was the third member of the trio. He was a wiry little man with a big sense of humor. One time, he and his partner sailed up the Yukon with their first steamboat, the New Racket. The Indians at Rampart had gathered on the shore to watch, so Mayo pulled in close to send them a greeting.
They blew the whistle. The Indians just grabbed their babies and everything and took out to the woods. They wouldn't come out till they coached them back to the village.
One of the early pioneers was William Ogilvy. When the Sourdoughs talked about him, they almost always said he loved his job, he loved his country, and he was an honest man.
In 1887, he put the boundary in between Canada and Alaska by lunar observation and was only out a few feet. But I just am so proud to think that it was my grandfather that did it.
He carried his chronometer in his hand across the Dyea Trail. He carried it in his hand to be careful with it.
I just had the funniest feeling of going over the pass and saying to myself, how did they ever come out alive?
When Ogilvy was surveying claims in the Klondike, he had a small fraction left over that didn't belong to anybody. If he had staked it, he would have made a fortune. He said he didn't have the right to take advantage of his job, so he never staked a claim. That fraction was filed on by a Klondike prospector, and it produced $500,000.
I don't think he did anything for money. He did it for the love of the job itself.
Another trailblazer was the gold rush governor of Alaska, John Brady. There were thousands of men pouring into the country, and Brady had to meet their problems with practically no laws to back him up. One time he solved a problem personally when a bunch of down-and-outers were dumped on his doorstep.
They spent everything they had at Hope and Sunrise and had no money, and the boat brought them as far as Sitka and kicked them off.
The governor wasted no time.
Dad employed them. He wanted to keep them out of jail, and he couldn't see anybody suffer.
It was August 1896. Siwash George Carmack was fishing for salmon where the Klondike River joins the Yukon. His Indian wife Kate, his daughter Graffy, and 3 more Indian relatives were with him: Skookum Jim, Dawson Charlie, and Patsy Henderson. Earlier that month, a Canadian prospector by the name of Bob Henderson, who, by the way, was no relation to Patsy the Indian, stopped by Carmack's camp on his way to Gold Bottom Creek. Henderson said something then that may have cost him a fortune. He told Carmack his diggings on Gold Bottom Creek looked pretty good. And when Carmack asked if there was any ground left for staking, he said,
"Sure there's ground there, but I don't want any of your Siwash friends over there."
This insult may have been the reason Carmack never notified Bob Henderson when he struck it rich on Bonanza Creek. In spite of Henderson's remark, Carmack decided to take a trip over to Gold Bottom and have a look at Henderson's diggings. More than 60 years later, Patsy Henderson told about that trip when the big discovery was made.
Skookum Jim and Dawson Charlie and George Carmack, the 3 people, they were looking for Bob Henderson. Dawson Charlie is my brother. Skookum Jim is my uncle. But George Carmack, he told me, you got to stay here. You got to watch your fish trap, he told me. They went up on a Bonanza Creek. No Bonanza Creek yet. It's going to be Bonanza Creek pretty soon.
They finally reached Henderson's camp and looked over the ground. But Carmack decided it wasn't too interesting and headed back to his fish camp.
Next morning, they turned back. Skagway. Every place they tried to see gold. But they look a good place. They look a rich place, eh? But halfway they come down, but a quarter mile below an Aledo. They take a rest. They sit down, eh? You know Aledo yet. It's going to be Aledo pretty soon. So the Skookum John, he took the gold pond down the creek, you know. Down the creek, he put the shovel upon him. My guy got good gold. Good quartz gold. George, Skookum John called George, come down here. When George Carmack, he come. George said, that's gold. Good quartz gold. They got a shovel and a pick and golden pond, you know. When they tried the pond, they got a gold. That the gold come from the side hill. When they tried that, 10 different places, eh? When George says, I guess that's pretty good, he said. When they stuck the ground, 4 times they stacked it, eh? 4 times, one discoveries, eh? On a Bonanza. A Skookum Jam, #1 above, on a Bonanza. And George Carmack, #1 below, and Dawson Charlie, #2 below. 3 people, partners, eh? And 1 time discoveries, eh? About 4 times. The next day they come back, and down the camp, you know, Klondike. When they come back, they got the gold. Well, I see that gold, just like I don't care. Of course, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry, that gold, you know.
Young Patsy didn't know the value of gold. Just like I don't care, he said. I no savvy that gold. But George Carmack savvied, and so did the prospectors at 40 Mile when Carmack plunked a shotgun shell full of coarse gold down on the bar. Billy Auckland went to Dawson in '98. And when he was asked if he remembered an Indian boy in the Klondike whose name was Patsy Henderson, he said,
"Yes, do I know him? That little whelp. He used to be with Jim a great deal up on the claim. His home was down at Carcross. We call it Caribou Crossing. He was a nephew of Jim's, I think. Yeah."
That little whelp grew up to become the chief of the Tagish Indians. We told Billy, the next time we see Patsy, we'll say hello for you.
"If you ever do, just mention my name. But make it Billy Auckland. And you'll see a broad grin on him."
People have given credit to Skookum Jim, Dawson Charlie, and even Kate Carmack for the Klondike discovery. But Billy Auckland, who knew Carmack well, and who was a friend of Skookum Jim, offered a point of view that seemed to make sense.
George Carmack was pretty well acquainted with it all, and he said to Jim, "We'll sink a hole here." And why, they fell into a jeweler's shop. It was immensely rich.
There was no doubt in Billy's mind who discovered the Klondike.
Carmack was the discoverer. Jim wouldn't have had the ability to make the discovery, and he didn't have the knowledge of mining to the extent of being able to sink a shaft and make that discovery.
We can draw our own conclusions about who picked up the first nuggets on Bonanza. But the fact remains the discovery claim was filed by George Washington Carmack. The prospectors couldn't figure Carmack out, for he never seemed to be interested in gold. He was a dreamer, and he liked to write poetry and quote Shakespeare, and listen to the music of an organ.
He was fair, blue eyes, always wore a mustache because he said his nose was so large that if he had a mustache, it kind of hid his nose, you know. He'd kid about it.
He was slow-talking and easygoing, and he seemed to prefer the company of Indians to white men.
Bob Henderson, he was quite angry, too, because my father stuck up for the Indians. That's where he got his name, Siwash George.
When word reached the outside, the stampede started, and the imagination of thousands was fired by the first gold brought out by the lucky miners who had staked early.
I saw Swiftwater Bill from the third floor of the Hotel Seattle throw a handful of nuggets to the people that were on Pioneer Square. And these people scrambling for that gold, then there I become enthusiastic to come and get some of that wealth.
For a great many men, the Klondike was their last big gamble with life. As they headed north, some went up the Yukon. Some took the old route through the Caribou and the Cassiar, and some took the Skagway and Dyea trails over the passes. But of all the routes to the Klondike, none was more impossible than the Edmonton Trail. 1,500 miles over rocky mountains, wild rivers, and bug-infested swamps. Most of the men who survived it were broken in spirit and pocketbook, and were months too late when they reached the gold fields. Christian Falkenberg suffered frostbite, illness, and starvation. He lost his dogs, his clothing, his supplies, and in the end his desire for gold. But in spite of it all, he made it to Dawson, which may have been more important than the gold itself.
John and I went the Edmonton Trail. Took 22 months. Rain and snow, spring, winter, summer, for 22 months. We had 8 dogs, Scotch collie dogs. We bought 8 dogs from Abraham Lincoln's eldest son, Robert T. Lincoln, his name was.
Mr. Lincoln's dogs were thoroughbred collies, good for herding sheep and cattle, but they were no match for the Canadian wilderness. They never pulled a pound. The most successful route was hardly a picnic, but it brought the biggest surge of men into the Klondike in 97 and 98 over the Chilkoot Pass from Dyea. Billy Auckland went up the Chilkoot, and his story of the long trek was the story of thousands, but most of them were not as lucky as he was.
I went up on the old steamer Alki from here to Skagway. Well, I landed at Dyea in order to take the Dyea trail up over the hills, over the mountains. So I humped myself up under 100 pounds and I start out. That was the common load for a good husky man. And when I got to the top of the hill, I said, this is too much for Willie. He can make his money easier than this. I could have it packed up for 2 cents a pound, I think. There was Indian packers there and white men too, and making a business of packing. That's the only pack I ever packed over the hill.
Most of the men struggled up that 45-degree slope with 1,500 pounds, 100 pounds at a time. But some of them didn't make it. They pulled their hearts out and died on the trail.
it had taken you an hour and a half to get up there with a load. But when you got ready to come down, you'd sit right up at the top of this gully and pull the tail of your parky up with a piece of stick of some sort under your arm here like a paddle, and you just turn yourself loose and zip, you come right down there like you were shot out of a gun. And when you hit the bottom, there was so much loose snow had been worn off from the sliding that you plunged like you were going right into a flour barrel. And you had to get out of there pretty quick. Some fellow would have his feet in your backbone about the next thing you do. He's right after you, coming down one after another.
By spring, there was a mountain of outfits buried in the snow at the top of the pass. And when the big thaw came, there were still hills, lakes, and a river to run before the trail ended.
The whole thing to me is just the old climb, and go down the river expecting to run into sweepers and everything else and upset.
This was the fear of many a man who could handle anything on land, but who was helpless on the water. Many of the helpless ones died at White Horse Rapids, so they bypassed the rapids with a long wood tramway. But before that, experienced boatmen like Billy Auckland led the Sourdoughs through the dangerous water.
I volunteered, and I stayed there 3 days and did nothing but just shoot boats down through that confounded canyon and through White Horse and back up again.
Lake LaBarge was the next hurdle, and to the unsuspecting it looked innocent. But Billy discovered that all still water didn't run deep.
Right at the foot of Lake LaBarge, where it narrows up to go down the river, just before you'd get down, going down the river, you'd see smooth water, but places a little sort of a bubbling coming up. Look out, a rock within a few inches of the surface. But there were so many who did not know that that was a danger signal. Take a chunk right out of the bottom of the boat. Lots of them lost their lives right there.
A man wasn't out of trouble when he left Lake LaBarge, for there was still Five Finger Rapids, where 5 pillars of rock blocked the river like the teeth of a giant comb. Billy headed his boat for one of the channels and braced himself.
All of a sudden, you know, we took one good plunge, ka-plunk down there like that, and a big splash came up, and the dogs all jumped right back in on top of us here. Well, that's all there was to it. We was through Five Fingers.
The stern wheelers had a different technique of getting through Five Fingers.
The steamers going up the river, in order to go through Five Fingers, they stayed to the left-hand side going up. And they had a long cable hitched onto something up yonder and came right down here with a float. Well, the fellow would come up with a little stern wheel steamer, you know, and they'd reach down with a grab hook and pull up the cable and take a turn or two around the capstan and chugga, away we go. And when he gets up through there, throw the cable off and we're off.
After Five Fingers, it was clear sailing all the way to the gold fields.
I landed in Dawson in the first days of June. You've heard of Skookum Jim, the Indian, and George Carmack? I got acquainted with the Indian and Carmack. About that time, the Indian and Carmack were in trouble with each other.
It was the trouble of 2 men who had grown apart. Gold somehow had made a difference. Siwash George no longer wanted to live like an Indian, and Skookum Jim no longer needed Carmack, so they parted ways. It was then Billy Auckland, who had become Jim's friend, got the chance to do the job he had come for.
When you can see your way clear, I said, I would like very much to have a lease on a piece of this ground. So they gave me the lease. I got a lease on a piece right at the mouth of Little Skookum Gulch, if you know where that is. Well, anyhow, what money I made mining in there, I made right there.
The western frontier that produced Jesse James and Billy the Kid was also the incubator for the great con men of the North, Jefferson Randolph Soapy Smith, dictator of Skagway.
I knew Soapy Smith in Denver. I saw him in Sourdoughs.
A $10 bill in certain packages of soap, and then he'd mix them all up, and he added them all up, and he had them marked, and when he come to that bar of soap, why, one of his stooges would be out in the crowd. He was the guy that bought it.
Even the Yukon dog team mail drivers were conned into believing that Soapy Smith controlled the mail.
We didn't know nothing about Soapy Smith them days. We thought he was the marshal. But to get the mail, we had to have a permission from him or one of his men.
It was a long rope the frightened citizens of Skagway gave Soapy Smith, and it looked as though it would never hang him, until one of his men stole a $2,800 poke from a Klondike miner and forced a showdown with the king of the gateway town.
He was shot on Moore's Wharf in Skagway by a fellow named Frank Reed.
Smith fortified himself with alcohol and headed for the waterfront where the vigilantes had gathered.
And Soapy Smith had a rifle, and he shot Reed with the rifle, and Reed pulled his six-shooter out of his pocket, you see, at the same time. And he shot, and they both were killed, you see.
Just 4 days before he was shot, Smith celebrated Independence Day as Skagway's leading citizen. He sat on the speaker's platform next to the honored guest from Sitka, Alaska's Governor John Brady. It didn't take a Soapy Smith. With the help of the saloons, the dance halls, and gambling houses, they became rather adept at it themselves. One time in Skagway, Skookum Jim, Dawson Charlie, and their friends went about it in the style of an ancient potlatch.
They came down there in the fall of '98. They acquired this hotel for a potlatch party. In the morning, there wasn't a dresser, nor a bed, nor anything else in that house that wasn't just demolished. They just wrecked the whole business. I guess they had to pay for it all, but they had the money to pay for it.
Paying for it didn't always satisfy the law, as Skookum Jim discovered.
And Sergeant Major Snyder said, "Say, Jim, how many times have you been arrested and thrown on the wood pile?" They called it wood pile. Jim says, "Oh, maybe 1,000 times. What for, you ask me? You jealous?"
Most of the miners were not as violent about it as Skookum Jim, but they managed to get rid of the gold as fast as they made it.
There was a girl some time ago when I was panning up there, and she said, "Do you ever make any money here?" I said, "Sure, I made money." She said, "What do you do with it?" "I spend it."
One of the most important institutions of the gold rush was the fleet of stern-wheel steamers that plied the Yukon.
We enjoyed a fine fleet of steamboats from Whitehorse to Dawson, all commencing at about 1899, 1900, 1901.
The old-timers regretted their passing, for they represented one more chance for adventure. The picturesque old boats crawled through hundreds of miles of mountains and plains. They visited trading posts, missions, Indian villages, and woodchopper stations. They would even stop to pick up a single sourdough who needed a ride.
Well, we have wonderful trips. Travel on those boats. We sure miss them.
Some of them were floating palaces, and their grandeur is betrayed even today in the old hulks propped up on the banks of Whitehorse, Carcross, and Dawson City. But there was more than romance connected with the Yukon steamers. For buzzsaw Jimmy Richards, they were a stepping stone to a new way of life. He had been an engineer and a fireman on 8 boats.
I knew all about running steamboats and firing and engineering on the river, and that meant passing up and down the river. I see what these wood choppers were doing. They was flying all the boats along with wood, and they were getting a big price and making up to $30 or $40 a day cutting wood. Wood chopper would put in maybe only about 3 years here, and he'd have maybe $10,000 or $15,000 and go back home and nothing to it, and live like a prince and get his girl and all that. A poor old miner on the creeks, he'd get some beans and bacon and not much of it, and then just a terrible life. He was a hell of a lot of difference.
Jimmy finally graduated to a big buzzsaw, and that's how he got his name. And he found there was also a hell of a lot of difference between sawing wood for the city of Whitehorse and cutting it by hand on the Yukon. Hard on the heels of the steamboats came the White Pass Yukon Railway that refused to die. Bill McBride remembered a humorous incident when he was a boy traveling on the railway to Lake Bennett in 1899. The train was chugging along when just a little way ahead he thought he saw a decorated Christmas tree in the middle of nowhere.
And this tree appeared to be all full of biscuits and pancakes and whatnot. And we found out that it was the tree squirrels around the construction camp had put all this stuff up in the tree to keep it away from the ground squirrels. That's one of the things that would appeal to a small boy.
Bill was working for the Northern Navigation Steamship Company based at St. Michael when the White Pass Railway bought it out and sent him to Whitehorse.
And today I am the last of the Mohicans. I'm the last one of that outfit still working up in the Yukon.
And now Bill, too, is gone from the Yukon. One of the saddest moments for the Klondikers was the death of the overland stages and the big log roadhouses that dotted the route from Whitehorse to Dawson.
And we were 15 days on the road on the stage at 60 below every morning. You made only one post a day. Couldn't travel any faster at 60 below with horses.
And they had in the neighborhood of 300 horses staked out along the trail at relay posts, a relay post every 20 miles. And they put 4 and 6 horses on these stages carrying the passengers and the mail.
And those 4 horses, beauties, you know, and just right on the bit, ready to go, and away we went. And the screaming of the runners over the rocks, and it was cold.
But you didn't mind it. You were wrapped up. You were comfortably on the stage, you know. And a foot warmer.
They wrapped you in a buffalo robe in those days and put a foot warmer at your feet and hope you kept warm till you got to the next relay station.
Every 25 miles there was a roadhouse where you could rest and get good meals and a comfortable bed. And always clean. And I'm telling you that when you got in there, no matter how the bar was full, of course these boys would always say, hush, there's a lady. They were wonderful places.
Changing horses at some of the relay stations was a contest with time, reminiscent of the Pony Express.
And the minute we drive up there is 2 men run out, and one reaches up and grabs the lines from the driver. The other runs round and unhooks the tugs. The other fellow runs and opens these doors up, and the horses go right in there where it's warm. In a few minutes, out come 4 more that were all harnessed and ready to go. He swings them around, hooks up everything, and away we go again.
Memories of the stage were memories of fun and good conversation, the time to talk and make friendships. They were also the memories of hilarious moments when someone needed a rest stop between roadhouses. Billy Auckland enjoyed the time when a delicate lady informed her husband she could wait no longer.
Driver, stop her. I gotta get out. This Jimmy Williams was a large man, and he had acquired a very beautiful big coonskin coat. His wife was a tidy-looking little body. Jimmy lumbers out over the side of the sled and picks his wife off and sets her down, and he plows through the snow, and she comes along, and Jimmy unbuttons his big coat, he spreads it out and holds it there in front of her. It is a killer. Well, they couldn't resist taking a peek. Here's the big Jim with that darn great big overcoat spread out, and a little woman back here someplace, nobody knew where, but they had a good idea.
The gold rush not only spawned the river steamers, the railroad, and the stage, but a lifeline to the miners themselves, the pack trains that hauled in supplies and hauled out the gold.
And they were 2 brothers, the Bartletts. They had pack trains in there, mostly mules. They'd done quite a business, packing.
Ed Bartlett was known in every mining camp in the north. Before the Klondike Stampede, he was packing in British Columbia.
And he went into Dawson in 98. I think that he and Mike and Al constituted the Bartlett brothers, and they established a pack train service from Dawson to the creeks, using mules.
Ed and his brothers provided a badly needed service to the miners and made money at it.
In fact, I think he made a lot of money at Dawson, probably much more than if he had been mining.
By '99, the need for pack trains was declining.
The next thing was the stampede at Nome. Well, nothing would do for my father except to go to Nome.
In Nome, as in Dawson, the big mining operations replaced the small diggings, and the need for pack trains disappeared there, too.
My father went over to Fairbanks in 1904. Things were a-booming then.
And thus it was with Ed Bartlett and his pack trains. Wherever it was booming, they'd be there.
He went everywhere where the discovery of gold was reported.
As Dawson prospered, business flourished, with stores, bars, restaurants, dance halls, theaters, newspapers, photographic studios, and jewelry shops. Some old-timers will never forget the squeak and clatter of Charlie Jenneret's homemade jeweler's lathe. He made himself a fortune on that lathe, turning out jewelry for the kings of the Klondike and their ladies. Another famous Klondiker mined his gold with a pen, a brush, and a piece of charcoal. He was an artist, and he signed his sketches with the outline of a husky dog.
Well, about my father, Arthur Buell, it was the biggest experience of his life, you know. He was a newspaper cartoonist, and he sketched all the leading people of the day, all the interesting characters, and his cartoons were usually on the front page of the paper. And this was in the days before photo engraving, you see. So the only way he had to reproduce these and put them in the paper was to make his own engravings. He made what are known as chalk plates. He'd draw the drawing in a little casting box filled with chalk, with a needle, you see. He'd scratch these drawings into the chalk and finally detailed portraits. And he was a very good one at catching a likeness quickly. But somebody said that he was the best chalk plate artist in the world, and he was very complimented until he remembered that he was the only chalk plate artist in the world.
Yeah, Art Buell was a wonderful character. He'd taken all these conventions and he'd sketch 3 or 4 people at the banquet that was part of the entertainment. Invariably, though, he would get a bald-headed fellow, you know, and his fingers would be covered with his charcoal, and he would put his hand on the top of his fellow's head to place his head in a certain direction. When he got all through, the guy probably head was all black. That was Art Buell. Arthur B. Buell. Yeah, he was a character and a dandy.
During the summer of '98, Dawson was a beehive of activity that never seemed to stop, except when there was an excuse for a holiday, which was as often as possible.
We used to celebrate the 24th of May and the 4th of July. And the 24th of May, of course, was the Queen's birthday. That'd be Queen Victoria.
Yes, we had 4th of July celebration here. Horses, races, and band playing and dancing on the street. Oh, they were having a great time.
The Canadians and Americans celebrated each other's national holidays. And one old-timer remembered a certain 4th of July parade when a couple of get-together bands tried to outdo each other. Miners didn't need a holiday as an excuse for a good time. After wallowing in the muck all day, they made every night an occasion for celebration. As soon as they had shaken off the mud from their diggings, they headed for the saloons and the gambling houses. The lonely ones usually went to the dance halls, where for a few moments they could take a woman in their arms for a whirl around the floor, or sit with her in a box if they could pay the price of the drinks.
I worked in the M&N. That's a wonderful place in the M&N. They had boxes up at the top where we could go and sit if a man wanted to buy a drink. And the wine was $10 and the girl got $5. And it had a wonderful great big bar. That bar had come from the old country somewhere. And we had an orchestra of 8 pieces, the latest in New York. And we'd dance. We get 50 cents out of every dollar we made. Oh, it was fun. And there was never a thing out of the way said or done.
You never seen any drunks on the floor. And the women, they were beautiful girls and dressed in nice evening clothes, you know.
Oh, everything was up to date. And even the girls, they got dresses from France.
Imported and sold by Madame Tremblay. The beautiful girls in their queenly gowns had a favorite trick for overly passionate men.
They all had a pocket full of keys. That did fit no door, but they used to sell a miner a key of their room for $10, and the miner had to go looking for the room, never found it. That was an old stunt.
We all had nicknames, of course. The Dutch Kid, Sweet Marie, Diamond Tooth Gertie, And then there's Kate Rockwell.
Kate Rockwell was better known as Klondike Kate, and her name was linked with the famous Alexander Pantages.
Well, now, Klondike Kate was not known as Klondike Kate in the early days. That was a moniker put on her by the Los Angeles newsboys up there, the reporters. And she's the one that staked Pantages to come to Seattle and start the moving picture business.
There was one dance hall queen who won fame throughout the Northland for her singing, dancing, and fabulous diamond-studded gowns and jewelry, from which she gained the name Diamond Lil. Years later, the aging queen struggled with the dim memories of her colorful past.
Some theatrical people, show people, that took me to Alaska. I went to Juneau first, and I had a powerhouse, you know, and I had a piano player there, and the girls were singing and dancing there. I went over the trail once to Fairbanks, and, you know, dog teams on the trail. I stayed at the Pioneer Hotel in Fairbanks, too.
With severe modesty, she spoke of her former life in the North.
Oh, I was in a dance hall, and I used to dance, and I used to dress nice, and wore a diamond arm bracelet, and used to sing and dance, and, you know.
Dawson boasted that she could provide everything from a magic show to Shakespeare to entertain her citizens. She even imported American stock companies to perform the popular theater of the day. Pauline Brown remembered one of the performers, who became a great star of the American theater.
There was Rambo, Margie Rambo. She had a picture thrown on a screen with a big skirt, and she danced, and then they put lights on her. Oh, she was beautiful.
Marjorie Rambeau came to Dawson when she was 15. This was several years after the flush of the stampede had faded. But she wasn't a stranger to gold rush life. At the age of 9, she entertained the miners in the saloons of Nome in 1899. After she left Nome, she became a leading lady in American theater. She even played Camille at the age of 13.
We went up there with a company when we went up to Dawson. And we opened in Millie Marianne, Israel Zangwill's great play. Well, they went perfectly mad about it. Well, this man that we were with, he took all the money and skipped and left us all stranded. They came to me and asked me if I'd stay over the winter. So I said, well, if I do, I'll have to have support. You work with me and I'll put on a play once a month for you. You know, I was only a youngster, imagine. Well, I found excellent talent there. I directed them, taught them everything they knew about it. Then I would have to work in the show, and if I'm wearing long skirts, I'd have to pin this up and then wrestle this 27-foot stuff with the old-fashioned stage braces and plug them down, and then help to move the piano on, then go on and play a lick. So it just started beautifully, and I just loved them up there. They were wonderful to me.
When Dawson was in full flower, the word came that a strike had been made at Nome, and suddenly the town lost nearly all of her hangers-on, and even many of those who had fair diggings left them in the hope of finding bigger ones. The Nome rush nearly equaled Dawson in every way except in the maintenance of law and order, for the careless gun and the smooth swindle were common enough to be immortalized by Rex Beach. The oddest thing of all was the gold itself. It poured out of the lodes and stuck in the sands of the ocean beach. One prospector said it was the greatest poor man's placer he had ever seen. As the rushers poured in, they suddenly created a beach-lined tent city more than 13 miles long.
With millions of little tents, all sizes, all colors.
There was a great crescent of white tents that actually stretched from Nome River, 3 miles east of Nome, to Penny River, 10 miles west.
And every so often, a little privy with 4 little sticks put down into the tundra with a burlap around it like that. And me with a roll of toilet paper on my finger and selling 3 of these sheets for 25 cents. No one even wanted to bother with 3 of those little sheets. There were plenty newspapers. So business wasn't so good.
However, business was good for the hucksters of every kind. But as it was with every gold rush, most of the hopefuls never found gold.
There was 50,000 people come to Nome, and many of them become despondent because of the vivid tales that they'd heard that only they had to do just pick up the gold off the sand.
And when they found that money wasn't so easy, they had to go out and work for wages.
There was one prospector who made up his mind he wouldn't work for wages. He was unlucky in the rush to Hope and Sunrise on Cook Inlet. But in Nome, his luck changed. Frank Wasky not only found gold, but was elected first delegate from Alaska to the Congress of the United States.
I was fascinated with tanning, you know. But on August 12th, 1900, I made a crackerjack discovery on a creek known as Dome Creek. It's a fact, you can just see a layer of yellow there, you know, you see, very fine gold. First pan I took out of the rim rock, I got $2 out of the thing.
Some of the Chichacos spent everything they had to get to Nome. And when they didn't find the fairy tale gold they were told was merely for the taking, they felt they had nothing more to live for.
I remember one man, he came off of the gangplank, took a pan of dirt, seen that there was no gold in that particular pan, and he took off his gun and shot himself.
Many a misfit found his way to Nome, and life there offered him a devil-take-the-hindmost freedom he had never known before.
All the riff-raff of the world came up there in those early days. Killing, shootings all the time.
The lawsuits were fought on the streets and the saloons just as much as they were in the courts, you see.
It was common to see people gathering, shooting scrapes and so forth, fighting for lots.
First time ever in the big saloon. And a man came up beside me, and I couldn't help it. Watched this man because he was so intent. All of a sudden, I could see him following this woman around like that. And with that, he just turned around like that, bang, and shot her. So that's why all my stage falls have always been natural, because I know how they fall now when they're shot. Oh, it was wild, it was woolly. Brutal town.
In 1899, Marjorie Rambeau went to Nome with her mother, who was a homeopathic physician. Her mother's business soon failed, and Marjorie had to bolster the family income by singing and playing the banjo in the saloons of Nome. But her mother was worried about what might happen to her, so she took steps to avoid a fate worse than death.
So to protect me, a little girl, they cut my hair off and put me into a turtleneck sweater and dungarees, and I had a little banjo that I played. No one knew me as a little girl. I was called the Yellow Kid, because I had blonde hair, and Rex Beach was the one that dubbed me the Yellow Kid. So I had this little copper bottle. So I commenced to sing songs that I'd heard my grandmother sing. And they say, well, where did you learn that? Oh, I said, hadn't you heard? That's just brand new from the States. And then they'd scream, you know. Then they'd fill the bottle again.
Seasoned old prospector Jules Gunderson savored the memory of those raucous, exciting, and dangerous days in Nome and the Kookarook.
Those are the days you ought to have been there. Say, sure had some swell girls, too. Used to have 66 of the girls back there. And they had one solid block of saloons, see, in front of this place. You know, a big high board fence around the place, you know? You can go in the saloon, you know, if you didn't want your friends to see you, you know. Go out the back door of the saloon and then cruise around and size them up, you know. But a funny thing happened that time. There was one little bit of a short guy, see, and he got pretty drunk. So they just took him and put him in a beer barrel.
Some of the heavy wood beer barrels of that time were big enough to hold a small man.
They put him in the barrel and nailed him in, you know, and threw him out in the Kookarook River. And there's a couple of fellows happened to be working down below, and they seen this barrel coming down. They thought, by God, there's a piece of kidney, see. So they grabbed the barrel, pulled it out. Otherwise, he'd have been drowned, see. Oh, I tell you, those are the days.
When the Nome excitement subsided, another big strike was made in the summer of 1902 by Felix Pedro on a creek subsequently named after him. And the pattern repeated itself as it had with every discovery from British Columbia to western Alaska. The Sourdoughs flitted from strike to strike like moths to a new flame, mucking out a little gold or making it, losing it, and moving on. And when word got to Nome, they were off again, and the rumor of the new stampede reached Dawson.
When they heard of the Fairbanks stampede, the news of the stampede was very meager. That was in the winter of 1902 and 3. And they hired this Jap to go to Fairbanks and get the news and bring it back. And he was known as Wada, the Jap. And he ran both ways. The Jap had to go from Dawson to Eagle to Circle, then over the trail to Chattanooga and to Fairbanks.
Fairbanks was the last of the big bonanzas, but she produced her share of colorful figures and hardy men who could pack 150 pounds for a full day on the trail. And both Fairbanks and Nome paid tribute to tough trail men and dog mushers by offering big cash prizes for grueling tests of endurance. And it wasn't always the young ones who took the prize money.
Yeah, just think of a man, 52 years old, won the marathon race here in Fairbanks. A fellow named Jerry Sullivan, see? And he run against a fellow named Wada, the Jap, that was a champion, see? Then he goes to work and he rests here 2 days, gets one dog and a little light sled and a sleeping bag, and he runs from here to Nome in 16 days. That's 800 miles, see? 50 miles a day. Could you do it?
Few men could meet the challenge of Jerry Sullivan, but there was one musher who baffled them all.
Did you ever hear of the Cipla dog racer? I used to drive with Cipla in the early days, you know.
The whole North knows of Leonard Seppala, the greatest musher of them all, whose record from Nome to Fairbanks stands today because he literally ran out of opponents. But unlike most of his rivals, he was a small man.
The real men of Alaska was the dog drivers those days, the real he-man. And of course, I didn't consider myself to be one of those because I'm so small.
Dog racing continues today, all over the North Country, but the races are not quite the same.
To me, dog racing today is sort of play work, what we used to call ladies' races in Nome in the early days.
The gold rush not only produced the he-men, the mining kings, the dance hall queens, and the promoters, but it also fed the talents of men who were clever with words, like Robert Service, Jack London, and Rex Beach. According to his niece Dorothy Stone, Rex Beach was the kind of a man who could understand the gold rush.
Well, I think he was a tremendous person and a great two-fisted guy. He had a great intellect, but quite an athlete, great shooter.
And he had a genuine humility about his writing and a love of life to which he devoted his vast energies with a rigid discipline.
He had a schedule, and he wrote all morning, whether he wanted to or not, whether he was inspired or not, didn't matter.
Talking about Rex Beach, he had a cabin in Rampart, and there used to be a little squaw up there they used to call Short and Dirty, and every time that she would get pinched for being stiff, why, they'd ask her name, and she'd invariably say Mrs. Rex Beach. Now, where she got the idea of it is, I don't know, but that was it. So then they would say, well, where did you get the liquor? Well, she'd say, I catch them from Soldier. So down to Fort Gibbon they'd go, and the marshal with Short and Dirty, and they'd get all the troops out there on the parade ground, and front rank with the bout face, and the commanding officer and all of his aides, and the marshal, and Short and Dirty go down through the ranks, and half these soldiers had a smile on their face, and when she got down through it, why, she was supposed to pick up the guy that gave her the liquor. Then she turned to the commanding officer and pointed at him and say, him. That's a fact. Yeah. Oh, it got to be a Josh. They wouldn't even pinch her anymore. They'd always get the same treatment.
The native women were not all like Short and Dirty. Most of them were simple, energetic, and devoted wives and mothers, like the Indian wives of Al Mayo, Arthur Harper, and Big Jack McQuestion. These women knew the North and could live by its often cruel demands. But the women who came from outside were put on trial by a life they had never known. However, there were few who did not survive its rigors.
Yeah, some of those pioneer women were certainly Americans to the core and pioneers to the core.
I come in here and a little shack, two-room shack, and the kitchen was made out of planks and stuff they fished out of the river. And there was a piece of matting on the floor. The rest was all boxes. And a little Yukon stove stood on a packing box, and I'd never seen one of those stoves. And that winter, it was 55 and 60 and 65 below all the time.
And I used to bring in those heavy chunks of frozen wood and keep the fire going day and night.
And I went out in the woodshed to get the boiler to put the diapers in, and have my hands in warm water, went out and the boiler stuck right to my hand, and I had to come in, carry it in that way and stand by the kitchen stove to thaw.
Some of these pioneer women not only had to face the inanimate discomforts of life in the North, but a few live ones too. Little Annie Falls never forgot one of them, a hungry bear who was no respecter of property.
Come there one night at that window, and his great big face was just full of the window. I chased him from the pantry. I just wakened up and I heard some boards breaking or something, and I out of bed and into the pantry, and there he was with his claws right through the screen, you know, and right into a cake that was in there. I never had a bit of sleep that night. I chased bear all night long.
The hardships of these women were not all domestic. Some of them spent many a weary day beside their husbands on the claims.
When we was over to Ruth Creek, we run two giants over there. He run one and I run one, you see.
And so did Jessie Mather, who years later still bore the pain of her efforts.
The giant spun around this way, and it hit me finally and sat on me, you know, the nozzle, and just pressed me to the earth. And they thought I'd broken a breastbone. Oh, it hurt. It still hurts, but it's okay.
Jessie accepted the pain without a word of regret. But on looking back, Annie Falls betrayed a little doubt about the value of it all.
You'd wonder all the stones and stuff that has to be moved to get a bit of gold.
For most of the Sourdoughs, that bit of gold was not the greatest reward of the stampede. Rather, it was a sense of fulfillment for having run the course, and a peculiar kind of trust born of a respect for those who had run it with them.
I saw Alaska in its heyday, loaded with glory, honest as honesty could ever happen to be. You didn't have a lock on the front door of your cabin. You came to a cabin, you could bet your bottom dollar there would be shavings, kindling wood, and dry matches there for you.
Here's something that's hard for people to understand. You have a cabin here on a creek. I don't know you, but I come down here to your cabin and it's evening, and I'm tired and hungry. I open the door and come in. I stay there overnight, and in the morning before I leave, I go out and I cut kindling and wood. I pile it all back in there, just as it was when I came in. I walk out. That's all there is to it.
You see, we realized that when that Yukon River froze over, we had to depend on one another for everything, and it brought us closer together.
It became a tradition for most of them to help a fellow miner with anything he needed, and not betray any doubt of his honesty.
And many of them had quite large quantities of gold. They kept this gold in the cabin. Never a lock on the door. However, nobody thought of stealing anything. They trusted each other.
The Northern Commercial Company wanted to capitalize on the trustworthiness and open generosity of the miners. So they created a symbol for their business which they hoped would reflect those same virtues.
Well, in one corner, there was one of these great big barrels. There was a tap down below and a tin cup. A rum, you know. You could walk into the store, take your drink, and nothing said. That's what it was for. Yeah. Oh, they were good old days. Yeah.
Harry Lehman's old Big Ben clock was a symbol that time was running out on the Sourdoughs, and a way of life the world would never see again. But the most remarkable thing about these men who pioneered the North is that time never became a signal of death. For as long as there was blood flowing in their veins, as long as there was a hill to climb, a shaft to sink, and a prospect to explore, time merely pushed them toward it. As 80-year-old Ben Falls said, he could never stay idle. He had to have a job to do.
After you do that job, you'll feel, oh God, I done a pretty good job after all, and I'm a pretty good man yet. I wouldn't like to outlive my usefulness, you know. I'd like to keep going.
Ben Falls kept going, and whenever his feet wouldn't move, his hope did. And so did the hope of Al Amaro, another 80-year-old prospector. For Al was still trying to get back into the hills, where there was a ledge of rock which he was certain held a fortune in gold. All he needed was a partner with a little money who could grub-stake him to go up there and take another look.
No, I'm broke, you know, and I could get partners on the ledge, not like you. But that'll cost you a few $100, you know. And I'd go 50-50 on the ledge, and I think it is too claim. And if there's more, why, we'll go 50-50 on it anyway, you see.
By the way, if you're interested in that ledge, you'll find it just beyond that last blue mountain. If you stand right here and look north, you can just barely see it.